A thoroughgoing ideal of fairness would shape prices, not only by co-determining the complications and changes of super-individual moments but also the extent of the state of the personal assets of the consumers. Individuals' circumstances, too, are objective facts that are very important for the carrying out of individual purchases. However, in principle they do not find any expression at all in price formation. Nonetheless, the fact that one can readily observe this gives this notion its basic paradoxicality. This paradoxicality confronts us in a very obvious manner within the phenomena that I earlier termed the superditum of wealth: the poor paid more for the same commodity than the rich. On many occasions, however, the contrary is also the case. The poor person often understands his needs to be cheaper and no more difficult to satisfy than the rich person. In a certain sense, the regulation of the price of a doctor's fee appears to be determined according to the circumstances of the consumer. Within certain limits, it is legitimate for the patient to pay the doctor according to his circumstances. Of course, this is particularly justified by the fact that the sick person finds himself in a situation of constraint. He must have a doctor, and this must therefore be organized from the outset on the basis of unequal payment for the same services. The citizen too finds himself in a similar situation of constraint in relation to the state whose services he cannot dispense with or even, if he wished, refuse. Therefore it is not surprising that the state takes from the poor a lower compensation for its services and less in taxes, and this not only because it offers greater benefits to the more wealthy. This external objectivity in adjusting reciprocal services has long been recognized as inappropriate and has been replaced by the principle of financial circumstances. The new equation is no less objective than the old one, it is only that it also incorporates personal circumstances among its elements. The new equation has a more appropriate objectivity because the elimination of the general economic circumstances of the individual from price formation, particularly where indispensable items are concerned, seems rather arbitrary and disregards the state of things. The variation in the fee for lawyers according to the value of what is contested points in the same direction. Whoever engages in a lawsuit over 20 marks may ask from the lawyer the same effort as a person in a position to contest a case concerning many thousands. In this way, the lawyer is also paid according to circumstances even though they appear in a more objective form than in relation to the doctor. This principle is the basis for further suggestions which will be dealt with in detail later, for example, that the law fixes fines not on a general level but according to level of income, or that the value of the object of litigation which is set as a limit for appeal to the highest court is no longer, as it was previously, an absolute amount but rather a percentage of the yearly income of the plaintiff. Indeed, the system of unequal prices corresponding to the means of the consumer has recently been declared a general remedy in social policy which would possess the advantages of socialism without its shortcomings. We are interested here not in the correctness but only in the existence of this proposal, which signifies in a peculiar way the completion of the economic development of trade. We saw its beginnings in the purely subjective personal change of possession through gifts and theft. By placing objects rather than people in relation with one another, exchange achieves a level of objectivity. At first it is rigidly formal and realized by fixed naturalistic quantities of exchange or by publicly imposed prices which, despite their objective form, remain completely subjective and arbitrary in their content. The more liberal trade of modern times enlarged this objectivity by incorporating all variable elements resulting from accidental circumstances into price formation. The objectivity of trade became more elastic and thus more comprehensive. The above suggestion finally attempts to objectify the most individual factors, such that the economic circumstances of the individual buyer are supposed to modify the price of those objects that he needs. This would be a counterpart or at least an extension of cost theory which claims that prices depend on the conditions of production. Now it would become dependent on the conditions of consumption, or at least vary according to them. If the latter conditions were to hold, then the interests of the producers would be secured, which, though utopian, is still logically possible, and prices then would adequately express at every sale all the individual circumstances on which they were based. Everything subjective would have become an objective legal element of price formation. Such a development would correspond a philosophical view of the world which sees all original objective data as subjective formations. But through this absolute retracing to the ego, it would gain the unity, cohesion and palpability that give meaning and value to what we call objectivity. Just as in this case the subject would transcend its antithesis to the object which it has completely absorbed and transcended, so, in the other case, the antithesis is overcome by the fact that the objective behavior has swallowed up all subjectivity without leaving a residue upon which the antithesis could survive. What is important in this context is that this ideal formation and the fragmentary approximations to reality are made possible by the concept of money. The sum total of economic situational elements can be fully used for price determination only if there is a uniform equivalent expression of value. Only the reduction to a common denominator provides that uniformity among all elements of an individual situation, which would allow their concurrence for the determination of prices according to just standards. Money's remarkable achievement is to make possible the most adequate realization and effectiveness of every individual complication, through the equalization of the greatest diversity, as if all specific forms must first be returned to the common primary element in order to secure complete freedom for individual reorganization. This achievement is the precondition for a line of development that will eliminate from the prices of things everything rigid that might distort the individual situation and which is expressed with a certain vehemence in the social principle of unequal prices. These prices, however, possess a relative equality in relation to consumers' circumstances and thereby form the subjective preconditions. Through their total inclusion according to a principle of complete objectivity, we first become conscious of objectivity through its absolute contrast with the subject. The distinction can in no way be sharp enough to release the object from its naive or confused identity with the subject. Only the higher level of intellectual development encompasses once more the comprehensive concept of objectivity which includes the subject within it. It no longer requires the immediacy of the contrast to be fixed and clear, but rather it raises the subject to a component part of an objective view of the world or to one of its aspects. In the earlier formulation, which also includes this development of the situation in which money favors the separation of owning and being, money clearly expresses and correspondingly concludes a process that had already developed on other levels of historical life. As long as the social order was based on the clan, a stable connection between the individual and the soil prevailed. For the clan was the overall owner of the soil, and its interests were identical with those of the individual. The clan formed the tie that connected being and owning before owning became individualistic. The subsequent transformation of the soil into private property, although it appeared to connect the person with his possession, nevertheless loosened any fundamental connection between them in so far as any arbitrary action with regard to the possession was now possible. The emergent money economy, first of all in the medieval cities, brought about a situation in which land could be mortgaged and rents received from it without affecting the owner personally or reducing his social position. The money economy separated the soil and its owner as a person to such an extent that a limitation upon the full property ownership as indicated by the mortgage would no longer be interpreted as the degradation of the owner. Mortgaging and selling appear only as the most extreme consequences of that separation between the person and the soil that is first made possible by money. However, this process had already commenced before money existed and at the moment when the institution of the clan dissolved. There is a similar process in the later development which transformed the patriarchal order into the constitutional state with equal rights before the law for all citizens. It also means the detachment of being from owning and of owning from being. Social position is no longer determined by landed property, and property, for its part, is no longer determined by membership of the nobility. This is the result of a whole variety of social movements such as the weakening of the nobility by the numerical increase in the lower strata, the division of labor among the lower strata which on the one hand creates a kind of aristocracy and on the other makes them indispensable to the landed aristocracy, the greater freedom of movement of those strata not tied to the land, etc. All these forces were in operation, for example, at the end of the Greek Middle Ages, when maritime trade and colonialism developed and Athens gained the upper hand economically.